Hi, this is part two of our talk about the Seminole Wars. If you missed part one of this video, you can go back to Friday's daily announcement in the stream to check it out. But we're going to move on to the rest of the story of the Seminole now. Okay, so at the end of our talk last time, we had just gotten through the First Seminole War. And after the First Seminole War, Florida officially became part of the United States. And as Americans started to move down into northern Florida, the United States government thought that it was necessary to make a deal with the Seminole Indians. So this map shows what the basic deal was. The Seminole Indians were moved away from their from their homes in the Panhandle and the northern part of Florida, and they were moved further south into central Florida. And this piece of land, it was a huge piece of land, 4 million acres, was given to the Seminole Indians. They were told that this was their land forever. And if we fast forward, that was in the 1820s. If we fast forward to the 1830s, everything's different now. Because as you know, in 1830, we had a president named Andrew Jackson. We had a law called the Indian Removal Act. And now the Seminole Indians were trying to keep their homes in central Florida. They were trying to keep from being removed from Florida altogether and sent to the Oklahoma Territory. And this is where we get into the Second Seminole War. So I think the first thing we should talk about is a treaty called the Treaty of Payne's Landing. And this is very typical of what happened between the United States government and Native American groups in the 1830s. Basically, we have a situation where Seminole chiefs were tricked into signing a treaty. They were told by the United States government that they had signed an agreement where they agreed to leave Florida peacefully. And of course, the Seminole leaders felt like they didn't agree to that. They were not willing to leave Florida. This is when a young warrior named Osceola made a name for himself. According to legend, when he saw the Treaty of Payne's Landing for the first time, he violently thrusted his hunting knife through the treaty and through the table, and he famously promised to make the white man red with blood. It wasn't too long after that before a letter arrived to the Seminole people. It was a letter that was actually written by President Andrew Jackson. And President Jackson, he encouraged the Seminole people to leave Florida peacefully and head for Oklahoma. He also threatened the Seminole with what would happen if they didn't leave peacefully. And a deadline was set. That deadline was December 28th, December 31st, the last day of 1835. And just 3 days before that, on December 28th, the Seminole let loose with a surprise attack. It was a two-prong attack. Seminole fighters led by Osceola, they attacked a United States military base called Fort King near present-day Ocala. And at the same time, other Seminole leaders, they led an attack that in history, we know it as the Dade Massacre. We know that a United States Army of 140 soldiers, we know they weren't ready for this attack when you hear that all of them were killed by the Seminole except only three survivors. And that's the Dade Massacre. And at this point, the Second Seminole War was on. Osceola was a Creek Indian from Alabama. His family had moved to Florida when Osceola was just a boy, and he was going to become an important and a nationally famous Seminole leader during the Second Seminole War. In 1838, during the middle of the Second Seminole War, he was captured. Infamously, he was tricked. He was lured to the United States Army under the pretense that they were having a meeting about a peace agreement, but they captured him instead. And while he was in a United States prison, he became ill. Historians think it was some sort of throat infection or maybe malaria, and Osceola died. Meanwhile, the fighting continued. And a lot of the fighting that took place in the Second Seminole War actually happened in our local area. For example, the United States Army set up a military base called Fort Pierce during the Second Seminole War. Also, some of the major battles of the Second Seminole War happened in places not too far from us. Like there was a major battle near Lake Okeechobee. There was another major battle near the Jupiter Inlet. Eventually, though, the United States military wasn't messing around. They sent 40,000 soldiers to fight the Second Seminole War. That was a very large force for this time in history. The United States spent over $30 million to win the Second Seminole War, a huge sum of money for that time in history. And eventually, they pushed the Seminole Indians further and further south into the Everglades in South Florida. By the time the fighting was over, there were only an estimated 300 Seminole left in Florida. And that wasn't the end of it. Most Seminole Indians, by the way, were either dead or they had been removed to Oklahoma. But the fighting continued. The fighting continued in the 1850s. In the 1850s, we get a third Seminole War. And at the end of the third Seminole War, there was only one group of Seminole Indians that were left in Florida. They were led by a man named Sam Jones, also known as Abiaki. And the United States military could not locate this final group of Seminole Indians. They were hiding out in a part of the Everglades known as the Big Cypress Swamp. They were deep in a dense jungle of swamp and wilderness. And finally, after the United States had spent millions of dollars, over 1,500 United States Army soldiers had died, the United States government had had enough. They agreed to let, we think it was somewhere around 100 Seminole, remain in South Florida. And because of that, those Seminole people, the descendants of those Seminole people in Florida, they refer to themselves as the unconquered.